Good team, so welcome to nerves, sensors and feedback. So this is the last topic that will be a part of exam 1. So we're going to look at the functions and components of the nervous system. So a bit of a recap from the nervous system topic in HAP last semester. We're going to look at the parts of a neuron, which is the cells that make up the nervous system. We're going to look at the major groups of neurons. So those are they're called plexi, and the pathways in which those groups of neurons stimulate different parts of the body. Then we're going to look at the relationship between proprioception and muscle function. So proprioception describes how our body understands its position in space, so moving around, and how those proprioceptive receptors then trigger muscle action to help us have stability around joints, allow us to move, and keep us balanced. Then we're going to look at the types of proprioceptors and interaction with joints and muscles, and finally the function and role of reciprocal inhibition. So a few different reflexes in a bit more detail than what we covered in HAP last semester. Okay, a bit of revision, the structure of the nervous system as a whole. So we have the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. CNS being the brain and the spinal cord, and then the peripheral nervous system being the part of the nervous system that sends the messages and creates movement and responds and detects the outside world. Peripheral nervous system then splits off into our autonomic nervous system, or the subconscious control, and then our somatic nervous system, which is under that voluntary control. Under our involuntary control, we have the parasympathetic nervous system, which is the rest and digest, and then our sympathetic nervous system, which is that stress system that is the fight or flight response. In terms of classification of neurons, so sort of three basic ones. Interneuron carries signals between neurons, so they're like sort of the main wiring structure. So it sends messages, carries the messages between the brain and the spinal cord. Then we have a motor neuron, which is the neuron that carries signals from the brain and the spinal cord to our muscles, so they create that motor movement. And then our sensory neurons, which transmit sensory signals between the brain and the spinal cord itself. Just like our muscle tissue, we have neural fascia or connective tissue which surrounds the different neurons to build our nervous system. And you'll see that the terms are very similar. Endoneurium, which surrounds an axon, that's the deepest layer of neural fascia. Just like endomysium, which is the deepest layer of muscle fascia. Then we have the perineurium, which surrounds bundles of axons, just like we have perimysium, which surrounds a bundle of muscle fibers. And then at the most superficial level, we have the epineurium, which surrounds an entire nerve, just like we have the epimysium, which surrounds an entire muscle. And if you see in this picture, a similar kind of structure to our muscle cells. And this fascia around our neurons provides protection, elongation, and elasticity. So it allows your nervous system structure to actually be a little bit pliable and movable. If it was really, really rigid and strict, it would be much more susceptible to injury. Okay, so now we're going to look at the different peripheral nerves in different regions. So peripheral meaning not the brain and spinal cord, so all of the messages that branch off the central nervous system. So we have 12 pairs, motor and sensory distribution, so both sending and receiving. These innervate the cranium and sense organs of the head. They innervate some cervical muscles, so cervical meaning around here, that's cervical region, C1 to C5. And then they also innervate aspects of the viscera, so some of that deeper tissue. If we look at peripheral nerves around the spine, they are then bundled into 4 different groups called plexi, which are your cervical, brachial, lumbar, and sacral. These nerve plexus are intersecting nerves, so separated into groups, so that helps to prevent injury or the severity of injury. I guess it's probably a little bit like the circuit board within a house and having wiring on different circuits. If everything was wired to one circuit and there was injury, then or there was a shortening within it, it would shut down the whole space. There's also 12 pairs of unbundled thoracic nerves extending out between the ribs. So we're just going to look at these in their individual groups. So we've got the cervical group, which is C1 to C5. So that same like region of the cervical spine innervates the diaphragm. So these nerves control diaphragm action and many of the muscles around the neck, which makes sense in terms of region. The brachial plexus. Brachial actually means the region of the arm. Together they provide innervation of muscles of the shoulder and arm and hand. So that's a big reason why it would be called brachial, that region, brachial region of the arm. Lumbar, so our lower L1, L4, innervates much of the pelvis and thigh. So in terms of like what parts of the body these groups of nerves stimulate, it's a big part of it is where they're positioned in terms of their region. And then sacral, so we know sacrum is at the bottom of the lumbar pelvis, L4 to S4. The sacrum is a series of fused bones. That's why you've still got like S1 to S4. So this innervates the thigh, leg, and foot. We've also got the sciatic nerve, which is you've probably heard before or know someone who's had impingement of the sciatic nerve. It's the largest nerve in the body, so that's why impingement of that nerve can cause a lot of pain, and it emerges from this group. Thoracic nerves. Fibers of first two thoracic nerves extend to the shoulder and the arms. The next four nerves extend to the chest, and then the lower five extend to the chest and the abdomen, and then the last one supplies the abdomen wall and buttocks. So we're talking about nerves that provide or send messages and receive messages from these regions. In terms of clinical application, the sciatic or tibial nerve travels across 3 different joints. So it may have a resting length of up to 1 meter, and it's squashed between different sheets of muscle and fascia. So direct pressure on peripheral nerves can result in symptoms such as things like shooting pain, numbness, and tingling. Okay, now we're going to look at receptors. So receptors are structures that detect and receive information, and they can also contribute to action happening within the autonomic nervous system. So receptors are cells that are sensitive to different types of stimulus. And in terms of proprioception, it's a stimulus pertaining to muscle and joint position. So this is how we can detect where our body is in position and if we're in balance or not. So we're going to look at 4 types: muscle spindles, Golgi tendon organs, Ruffini's end organs, and Pacinian corpuscles. So you might remember in the nervous system topic, and even in the skin topic, we talked about receptors being within that space. This is in more detail in terms of specific types of receptors and what they do. So we look at muscle spindles. The key word here is muscle. So these receptors are found within muscle, and they detect or monitor the stretch within a muscle and how fast that stretch happens. So if a muscle is stretched very, very quickly, and that rate of stretch reaches a certain threshold, then that causes that muscle that's being stretched to contract. It's a protective mechanism to stop muscles from stretching too quickly. If you stretch a muscle too quickly, then it's susceptible to tears. The Golgi tendon organs, again, tendon is the key word here, are receptors found within tendons. They don't monitor change in stretch. They monitor load or tension. So how much tension is being placed on a musculotendinous unit. So if you're lifting something super heavy and it's outside of your capability, then the Golgi tendon organs within that tendon that is receiving that load causes that muscle in question to relax, and the antagonist to contract. Also a safety mechanism. The Pacinian corpuscles and Ruffini's end organs are similar in terms of detecting changes in joint position through pressure and vibration. Pacinian corpuscles detect rapid changes in joint position, so really, really quickly. And then the Ruffini's end organs detect slow changes in joint position. So again, a part of their role is to understand if we are in balance or not, and how to keep that balance. So they monitor tissue changes around the joint. Pacinian's corpuscles fire quickly, sending many signals to the central nervous system as joint position changes. And then impulses stop when movements stop. So if we're not moving, then they aren't detecting that change around the joint. Ruffini's corpuscles also send impulses to central nervous system, but continue to send impulses even when movement stops. Pacinian is initiation of movement, so when movement is happening. Ruffini's in motion, already, or stationary. So you probably heard of muscle tone. It's a small amount of passive tension within a muscle, and it's generated by weak involuntary contractions. And these are set by the muscle spindles that detect that rate of change of stretch, and the GTOs, or Golgi tendon organs, which detect change in load within a tendon. So they help maintain a little bit of tension within a muscle. And you've got description of too much tone, or hypertonicity, or too low tone, hypotonicity. So there's a normal amount of tone that muscles should have. Overtraining or overloading of a certain type of muscle might increase its tonicity. And on the flip side, maybe overstretching of an area could lead to hypertonicity. Reflexes. So we're going to look at some reflexes. Reflexes, subconscious contractions of muscle in response to certain types of stimulus. So we've got an example would be the flexor withdrawal reflex, which is a flexion movement, so a flexion contraction of a muscle that withdraws a limb from a painful stimulus. So if you touch something sharp or hot, your muscles will contract to create a flexion to move your body away from that harm. Crossed extensor reflex is when you've got an injured limb. So the non-injured limb, or the contralateral limb, will compensate for loss of support when the injured limb, or the ipsilateral limb, withdraws from a painful stimulus. So if you're limping because of an injury to one leg, the other leg will, through a reflex, take that load. Similarly, if you stood on something sharp, your opposite leg would compensate by contracting based on the loss of support you'd had from your leg that's coming into contact with something sharp or detecting pain. Stretch reflex is utilizing the change in length of a muscle, so your muscle spindles. So when a muscle spindle detects a super quick change in length of a muscle, it triggers that muscle to contract. So that's the whole knee-jerk reaction. When a doctor whacks your knee, or just the distal or lower part of your kneecap, when your knee's in a relaxed, flexed position, what that causes is a rapid change in length of your quads, and then that reflex triggers those quadriceps to contract quickly, and that shoots your leg out, and that's a knee-jerk reaction, or to prevent against injury. We can use this in training or with athletes in terms of, if you can create a really quick lengthening, such as dropping down really, really quickly into a squat, it's going to trigger those muscles that create us to shoot up into an explosive jump to contract really, really fast. So we're using the stretch reflex to generate force. Reciprocal inhibition is a neurological reflex in which one muscle relaxes as the opposite muscle contracts. So this is also a safety mechanism. when you lift something heavy, your antagonist muscles of the agonists that are lifting that heavy load will actually be contracting and resisting your ability to lift that load. And that's to make sure that your agonist muscles are never contracting more than what they're capable of. So you might have experienced strength training before where you've actually increased your ability to lift load quite quickly within a short amount of time. Some of this, or a lot of this initial increase in strength is actually to do with this reciprocal inhibition where antagonist muscles are going, okay, I won't resist this movement so much anymore because I've been here and done this over the last few weeks. So some of that initial strength gain in the gym is actually just your nervous system being a bit more efficient and going, okay, antagonist muscles, just relax a little bit and let the agonists do their job because they're not at risk. Post-isometric relaxation, after a muscle contracts, there's naturally occurring relaxation response. So that's why you might get a client to relax against some contract against some tension to create or to encourage that muscle to go into a relaxed state. You might have also heard of PNF stretching, and it's proprio neuromuscular facilitative stretching, something like that. And it's a similar kind of idea where you put a muscle at stretch and it's at an end range of motion, and then you get the person to contract in that end range, and then once they relax, that agonist muscle goes into a greater relaxed state, and you can actually get more flexibility out of that muscle. PNF stretching, proprioceptive neuromuscular facilitation, I think it's called. So when you put a muscle under contraction, it will go into a greater state of relaxation and straight after. As well as reflexes in terms of creating muscles and tendons and joints and receptors around those spaces to contract. We also have equilibrium reflexes, which are associated with balance, and the key one is the righting reflex, and it keeps our head plumb. You might have heard of plumb meaning like neutral. So it detects changes in a degree of head tilt, and then muscles shift the body however required to keep that head plumb. So that's how we can get deviations too in things like our spine, or if someone has imbalances in limb lengths and stuff, what your body will do, and a lot of it is to do with where your head sits, because that needs to be plumb, is compensate. So that's how you can get compensatory postures within people because of imbalances in things like limb lengths and how much tone they have, posture. But the head will need to stay plumb, and the body will make changes to make sure that that happens. We're going to look at this a lot more when we get to the biomechanics space, but movement patterns, gesture, so seeing, and then action, so creating movement. This becomes a habit that you do over time, and then that then becomes a movement pattern. Basically what we're looking at is the nervous system sending a message for the first time, and then as it sends that message again, and your body learns from what happened previous, you start to create these stronger neurological pathways that ingrain into your nervous system and your motor units in terms of how your muscles can move. So it's a little bit like riding a bike. You might not do it for a long time, but you've ingrained those neurological pathways and motor unit pathways so that it's a pattern that you can repeat. Here's a little quote: "A neuromotor command is like a stream of water running down a hillside. The smoother and deeper the path gets, the stronger the current gets." So exactly that. Practicing a movement, your brain starts to send those messages over and over again. It grooves that neuromuscular pathway.